Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us here on Blackboard Collaborate. Before starting the webinar, I'd like to go over some practical information. In case of technical difficulties, you can contact moderator Ellen with a private chat message. Please also know that Google Chrome is the only browser which supports Blackboard Collaborate. You can turn off the pop-up notifications by changing your notification settings. At the end of the session, you can ask your questions via the chat. But we're also curious who's watching, so please let us know. This session will be recorded and will be made available on the UCSIA websites. Hello and welcome to the first UCSIA Summer School webinar. I am Jayeel Serrano, Project Coordinator, Religion, Culture and Society at UCSIA. And my colleague Ellen, is she here too?
Hi, I'm Ellen de Krane. I'm a Project Coordinator, Community Service Learning at UCSIA. And together we host the annual UCSIA Summer School on Religion, Culture and Society for young scholars at the University of Antwerp. And unfortunately, due to the pandemic, this year's edition is postponed to the summer of 2021. And we really look forward to meeting the 20 selected participants who will be working on the topic of religion, mobility and politics together with our three outstanding tutors, Jayeel Cornelio, David Hennig and Angie Heo.
And we are happy that two of the three tutors are joining us today for this webinar. With no further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote lecturer, Professor Jayeel Cornelio. He is Associate Professor and the Director of the Development Studies Program at Ateneo de Manila University. His work focuses on religious change in the Philippines with respect to youth, politics, and development. His first monograph, Being Catholic in the Contemporary Philippines, was published in 2016. Today, he will present us his new research on neoliberal Christianity and the rise of the new prosperity gospel in the Philippines. Welcome, Jayeel.
Hello, Hilke. Alan, I just wanted to be sure that my signal is strong. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Excellent. Okay, I am in this part of the world where the internet connection rather is unreliable. And so everybody who's joining us now has to bear with this internet connection. Thank you so much, Ellen and Hilke, for organizing this. I am so pleased to be back, albeit virtually, in Antwerp with you and with many of our former students. I can recognize some of their names in the chat box. Too bad that we can't really have our second summer school this year, and I suspect that some of our accepted students are joining us right now. So hello to you all. Angie and I are here. Angie is going to be stepping in later as our respondent, and she will be offering her questions and feedback also on this presentation. I wanted to say that UCSIA is a collegial environment which I consider to be an academic home in a way, because I was also a summer school student many years ago. This was when I was still a PhD student, I think, and this was more than a decade ago. And so now that I'm a tutor for the summer school, is quite a full circle experience for me. And so let me also state at the onset, now that I begin, that I recognize that there are different reasons for people's participation in this webinar. I understand that hundreds registered, and I suspect that not everybody is a sociologist. I will be approaching this topic, the new prosperity gospel in the Philippines, from the point of view of a sociologist. And I do understand, and I do recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that sometimes doing so can be offensive to believers or religious individuals. But anyway, if you have those points or very passionate ideas or feelings about what I'm going to spell out for you today, I hope that you will be willing to share them later on during the open forum. Finally, I wanted to say that this is a project that I conducted with our research associate at the Ateneo de Manila University here in the Philippines. His name is Aaron Medina. He's a young scholar, and we have co-written this piece, and he deserves the credit for co-writing this with me, and I am so honored to be mentoring him, a young scholar. And this project, by the way, has been funded by the Horizon 2020 program as part of the CRISI, or Consortium for Research and Alternative Regional Integration in Southeast Asia. It's, the Ateneo is part of that consortium. So let's start. I've got 40 minutes or so. The prosperity gospel has been a long-standing marker of contemporary Christianity in the Philippines. It preaches that material wealth and physical health are God's will for believers. We all know that. Its seeds were sown in the 1980s in charismatic circles in the Philippines, at least in the Philippines in the 1980s. It was a time when many new congregations and prayer groups, Catholic and otherwise, were attracting low-income followers. Social and civic engagements characterized the activities of these churches, but over time they became increasingly prosperity-oriented. So it doesn't mean that you're charismatic, you're automatically prosperity-oriented. Those are two different experiences, two different religious phenomena. The prosperity gospel provided the religious language for the material aspiration of Filipinos. It became most influential with the success of El Shaddai, a Catholic renewal movement led by Brother Mike Velarde. I'm going to get to them later on. Today, what I'm going to argue is that the prosperity gospel is discernible. Today, what I'm going to argue is that there is a new form of prosperity gospel. But let me give you a quick background of what the situation is right now. The prosperity gospel, as we know it, giving, receiving something in return, is discernible in many churches around the Philippines, both Catholic and Catholic charismatic groups and non-Catholic. Many of them are evangelical, Protestant, and so forth. A national survey run by Pew Forum in the Philippines revealed that 85% of charismatics agreed that God will grant material prosperity to all believers who have enough faith. For Filipino theologian Jayeel Serrano, this is the case too for coastal megachurches, which is his project, which are among the most influential religious institutions in the Philippines, apart from the Catholic Church. He observes that due to their links to Western Christianity, Pentecostal megachurches continue to be triumphalist, keyword, and have developed a theology of prosperity often expressed in their preaching. What I want to do in this presentation is to argue that a shift has taken place, ladies and gentlemen. We call this, Erin and I call this, the rise of the prosperity ethic, the prosperity ethic. Its dimensions set it apart from the previous incarnation of the prosperity gospel, which emphasized tithing and confessing. Again, we know that, traditional prosperity gospel. Specifically, the prosperity ethic, the new prosperity gospel, values upward mobility and uses biblical principles to justify the acquisition of practical skills to become rich. So it's already a giveaway for you. So it's not just about giving, tithing, confessing, tenets of the prosperity gospel as we know it, but now you have to acquire certain practical skills, much of which are in fact related to financial literacy, financial management. In this presentation, I'm going to make a case by drawing on the writings of both Sanchez and Chinkee. These are two of the most influential prosperity-oriented preachers in the country. And then towards the end, I'm going to explain this sociologically, historically, relating it to the neoliberal development in the Philippines. So those are, so you see in your screens right now, both Sanchez, Chinkee on your left, and then both Sanchez on your right. So, but just very quickly, let me give you an overview of what the prosperity gospel is and how it has been characterized in the literature. So this is the next slide. There are at least two basic origins, if you will, namely Pentecostal Christianity and then the New Thought movement. I don't have time to discuss all of this, but these are the two main influences, or if you want to do a history of thought of the prosperity gospel, you begin with Pentecostal Christianity in the early 20th century, and then the New Thought movement in the 1950s, mid 20th century. You must have heard of such ideas as changing your mindset and making things happen by changing your mindset. Later on, Pentecostal Christianity and New Thought movement got married to each other in the form of the Word of Faith movement. That's number 3. And it has its own theological basis in that Christ's death and resurrection fulfilled everything for humanity. And that means that all of our needs and all of our concerns have been addressed by God. It's a matter of activating your faith, confessing, and doing things religiously to experience God's prosperity. And then later on in the literature, in sociology of religion, anthropology of religion, and in religious studies, we find the economic turn in the scholarship on the prosperity gospel. Scholars have been very interested, for example, in how the prosperity gospel has affected individual social mobility. That's one strand. Increasingly now, there's a new strand relating the prosperity gospel to the marketization of society, which is happening around the world. And a case in point is Joel Osteen and the theology of consumption that he proclaims. So again, I don't have time to cover all of the literature. Maybe during the open forum we can come to that, because I want to spend more time this now to the research itself. So what did we do in the Philippines? I'm seeing your comments right now. I'm saying hello to you all. I recognize many names, and and thank you for being here. All right, what did we do? So let me talk about our methods. Initially, I have to admit that we wanted to interview these authors, Bo Sanchez and Chinkee. And I have to say, by the way, and I think Angie is going to mention this later on as well, even though this is a research that is primarily focused on the Philippines, I think much of its findings could resonate with the experiences of the prosperity gospel elsewhere. And I leave it up again to you to bring up many of these insights later on. But along the way, I'll be mentioning some of them as well. So we wanted to talk to Bo Sanchez. We wanted to talk to Chinkee. They were initially willing, but later on, we realized that there was so much that we could draw already from their books. They have written many books, and many of them are bestseller. And by the way, you have to realize that both Bo Sanchez and Chinkee are followed massively by both Catholics and evangelicals in the country. So let me introduce you to Bo Sanchez, who has about 2.6 to almost 2.7 now, 2.7 million followers on Facebook alone. So his other social media accounts are massively followed as well. And he is a Catholic, charismatic lay preacher. Back in the 1990s when I was growing up, I already heard him. But he was not known for the prosperity gospel. He was in fact known for his motivational speaking and talks around the Philippines. And he's also known for his group. It's a Catholic charismatic group called the Light of Jesus Family. And every week now they have what they call the feast, different branches around the country and in other places also where there are Filipinos, namely around the world. And now Bo Sanchez has written many books, and let me just introduce to you 4 of them. So you can see the title, How Good People Like Us Can Become Rich, The Abundance Formula, 8 Secrets of the Truly Rich, and 8 Habits of the Happy Millionaire. So what Erin and I did was we went through all these texts plus more and did a content analysis. We'll get to that in a bit. The next author that we want to that we spent a lot of time reading his writings is this guy called Chinkee. Chinkee, which is the next slide. Chinkee is known for his many books as well. But what makes him different is that he's evangelical, and he was at one point an evangelical pastor of a mega church here in the country. And every time he repackaged himself, and if you visit his website, Chinkee, you will see that he is projecting himself as a consultant of sorts. Whereas Bo Sanchez presents himself as a Catholic lay preacher, you've got Chinkee here who shows that yeah, he wants to teach Filipinos to become wealthy and debt-free, and he has consulted for Jollibee, Fujitsu, Shangri-La, and all these big companies in the country. At least before the COVID era, surely things have changed, or maybe they haven't. Let's see. After COVID, so there you have Chinkee. So we put them together. We have a Catholic lay, charismatic lay preacher, and then we've got an evangelical preacher writing essentially the similar message for the Filipino reader. And they are very much known for their speaking engagements around the country. And let me just say that what's unique about Chinkee is that in as much as he presents himself as a consultant that downplaying the religious identity, the truth is when you read his books, you find a lot of religious overtones and undertones in the text. Okay, so now on to the findings. So what is the prosperity ethic? So here we go, the prosperity ethic. What's our main point? And this is the next slide. The main point, the new prosperity in gospel in the Philippines has three main characteristics. I'll be spelling them out for you one by one. Believing right, thinking right, and then doing right. The first one is about having the right beliefs about the morality of wealth. The second is about internalizing positive thoughts about becoming wealthy. The last is about following practical steps in acquiring wealth. So, taken together, all these three provide the religious justifications for the aspiration to become wealthy. And the financial management practices that believers should adopt. The new prosperity gospel, in other words, is not only about believing, confessing, and giving. Aspects that I already argued a while ago, mentioned a while ago, are part of what might call the traditional or the older form of the prosperity gospel. It is a work ethic. The prosperity ethic is a work ethic that marries biblical principles and financial management. This is already a giveaway for you. The financial management is what really makes it unique and very different, but there are more nuances along the way. Inspired by critical scholarship on inspirational figures who provide ethical frameworks to make capitalism acceptable, we're calling this the prosperity ethic. In what follows, in the next few slides, the aim of both Sanchez and Chinkee is clear. They want people to have financial freedom while achieving spiritual well-being. Despite their denominational differences, their messages on prosperity and spirituality converge. One is Catholic, one is evangelical, but anyway, they are married to this message of prosperity. And might I say as well, ladies and gentlemen, before we carry on, that there is this, if you talk to them, and they even in their own writings, they would assert that in fact, they don't consider themselves to be prosperity preachers. So in a way, we are imposing that category on them, precisely because when you read their text, you will definitely recognize how the Christian message, the gospel, if you will, is in fact really framed with a very strong prosperity orientation. But there are a lot of nuances that I will be explaining now. So, first, believing right. That's the first aspect that we pick up, the first theme that we pick up from all the books that we have read. And we've read majority of their books related to prosperity. So what does the believing right mean? A proper mindset is necessary to experience God's blessings. So that's the next slide. The theological premise is not new. God is a rich God who loves people who, because of their faithful giving, shall receive divine favor. That's the next slide. Okay, if you may. God is a rich God who loves people who, because of their faithful giving, shall receive divine favor. We all know that. Verses Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 18, are used to demonstrate that wealth is God's blessing. But worth noting are Tan's and Sanchez's assertions about having a specific mindset when it comes to wealth acquisition. Tan, for example, Chinkee writes about the link between having a proper mindset and pursuing the proper action to achieve results. Um, and for him, in order to be rich, in order to be rich, we must start with a healthy, right mindset with regard to money. Okay, can we move to the next slide, if I may, if you could, right? To have a right mindset is to use the Bible as a reference for the wealth of wisdom it holds about money and success. The same is true with Sanchez, who, in explaining financial blessings, suggests that to receive blessings begins with having a mindset to create money. Okay. What then is the purpose of wealth? For both, for both Sanchez and Tan, wealth is part of God's blessing and must never be self-serving. This is quite interesting. It must be used, money must be used to help or bless other people. Citing 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, both underscore wealth as a means to uh, before that. Right? Uh, um, what then is the purpose of wealth? So it must be used to help or bless other people. Citing 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, both underscore wealth as a means to serve and enrich others, to bless the poor, and to prosper others. To be mindful of such purpose is to avoid materialism. Examples of initiatives that can satisfy the purpose of wealth include giving funds to church ministries and supporting charity institutions. Quite telling is the fact that Bo Sanchez himself has a widely promoted Anawim, a foundation that houses abandoned children and the elderly. Sharing material blessings for the good of other people is more meaningful since believers use them for love. For Tan, money is meant to be enjoyed, shared, and used to serve other people by meeting their needs. He claims that money, if used properly, can bless the world. Both authors caution their readers about their motives since money itself is not inherently evil. What is clear here, ladies and gentlemen, is that both give a moral dimension to the acquisition of wealth. Um, of course, ladies and gentlemen, this is not to discount tithes and offerings. Some of you might be very familiar with this already. Part of the prosperity gospel is giving your tithes and giving your offerings. Why? Because they're going to give back to you maybe 100-fold, maybe 1,000-fold what you have given him or the church. For both authors, money given to God are investments, there you go, with the greatest possible returns that no other investments can match. Quote, although neither claims that giving money to God through the church extracts physical returns from God, this is interesting, both still emphasize the analogy of sowing in which your harvest, quote, will be determined by your giving. Give and it will come back to you. Sanchez proclaims the law of reciprocity, which characterizes giving and receiving as an irrevocable principle. Believers can expect the blessing to be more than what they have given. The continuity with older forms of the prosperity gospel is clear. So that's it. That's the first one, believing right. The second one, okay, is thinking right. So if you could go to the thinking right slide, that must be slide 10. The prosperity ethic, this is the second one, also encourages believers to internalize a specific mindset about getting rich. So this is not just about believing right, this is about thinking right, having the right mindset. To be sure, both Tan and Sanchez believe that God desires people to prosper. They take Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11 as biblical basis. They boldly describe God as a, quote, business partner who gives people the ability to produce wealth. You find that in Deuteronomy as well. But they also believe that God would not bless people without preconditions. Having the right attitudes is the precondition. Your thoughts should be correct. Sanchez, for example, rejects what he characterizes, and the Filipinos in the audience would recognize this, bahala na, or in English, come what may, attitude of many Filipinos. Sanchez rejects that attitude. You don't wait. He persuades his readers to be open to what? Acquiring new skills, since God designed us to work and trust not just to trust. God designed us to work and trust, not just to trust. So you see now the detachment from the previous form of the prosperity gospel. In his worldview, having a positive attitude is what attracts favorable opportunities to be successful. Sanchez thus claims that when you send out a wish, quote, you move the universe to action. You find it there on the screen. When you send out a wish, you move the universe to action. It's really, practically speaking, it's about having the right attitudes. Tan echoes this point by calling on his readers to renew their thought life by adopting a money mindset. So quite interesting there, having a money mindset. Interestingly, Sanchez is more assertive than Tan in arguing that a wealth mindset is more important than financial literacy, since money problems, according to him, are mind problems. He also believes in the power of beliefs to define reality. So, how does belief affect prosperity? How does belief affect prosperity? According to Sanchez, the seed of prosperity, quote, will grow to the size of your belief. So again, we see the resonance with the older forms of the prosperity gospel. To illustrate this, Sanchez dramatically tells the story of Marion Luna Brem. Brem was diagnosed with terminal cancer and divorced by her husband. She incurred huge hospital debt as a result. Desperate, Brem decided to find a job, but she was rejected more than 16 times. In spite of the failures, Brem carried on with a changed mindset, believing that this should not be the end of her story. After being given 2 to 5 years to live, Brem managed to live longer and become successful by building a business empire with millions in annual revenues. Talk about positive testimony, ladies and gentlemen. With this inspiring story, Sanchez persuades his readers that nothing is impossible for a person with strong determination. There can be miracles when you believe. In other words, in the prosperity ethic, next slide. In other words, in the prosperity ethic, sin is not the hindrance to blessings, but one's attitudes. That people are not open to learning and that they are undisciplined are part of this poverty mindset. You're poor because you don't have the right mindset. In fact, both authors consider blaming the government, please listen carefully, both authors consider blaming the government as an act of evading personal responsibility over one's circumstances. You cannot blame the government. According to Sanchez, don't blame the government for your poverty. When you blame them, you constantly wait for your salvation from the government. But my friend, Sanchez says, the government will not save you. Don't wait for prosperity from any politician or government. The government will not do it for you. So, what do we have here? Thinking right is an innovation in itself to the older forms of the prosperity gospel that asks believers to strengthen their faith by memorizing and confessing scriptures. That's the old form of the prosperity gospel. What we have here, ladies and gentlemen, is that the battleground, and this is on your screen right now, in other words, is not with the confession per se, but with what goes on in a person's mind. While the prosperity ethic is on the surface an aspiration to be wealthy because it is God's will, it is at its core a longing for redemption, not from sin, but from the poverty of the mind. That's thinking right for you. The last one, ladies and gentlemen, is doing it right. Okay? Doing it right. Here we go. Finally, the prosperity ethic demands the acquisition of financial skills to enact one's faith. What is unique about Tan's and Sanchez's writings is the untroubled integration of biblical principles with practical skills. So this is where the financial management comes in. In our view, this feature is yet again a distinction from older forms of the prosperity gospel. Both authors embrace the acquisition of financial skills, or what we might call, quote, rules-based practices. Doing it right, in other words, the next slide, okay, Doing it right, in other words, is as essential as the other elements of the prosperity ethic. The third element is doing it right. So believing right, thinking right, doing it right. So what do we mean by that, or what do they mean by that? To identify which skills matter, Sanchez's and Tan's readers need to know the differences between, listen carefully, between the rich and the poor in terms of their financial beliefs and habits. So they really make a distinction between the habits of the rich and then the habits of the poor. In the latter chapters of Tan's For Richer and for Poorer, interesting book. If you have an opportunity, please try to get a copy. Chinkee makes a distinction between the poor and the rich according to their supposed lifestyles and habits. In his observation, poor people, according to Chinkee, unlike the rich, poor people value entertainment more than they do education. So they're more interested in education than they are in they're more interested in entertainment than they are in education. When they are invited to a financial seminar, according to uh, Tan, the poor always complain for the expensive seminar fees. However, rich people, according to Tan, always find a way to attend these events even for a cost. For Tan, the cost of learning valued by the rich is still less than the cost of ignorance shown by the poor. Those are heavy words if you think about it. Similarly, for Sanchez, the decision to be rich, quote, lies in acquiring a uh, set of specific habits. For Tan, even if we want to be rich, but if we fail to plan to take time in doing the necessary steps to become rich and move towards that direction, quote, we will never be rich. Attending seminars about financial management, reading about financial literacy are investments that Christians should adopt. So we have to be aware of the various financial tools and financial management skills. Because God wants to bless us anyway, we might as well just take up these skills and by default we will get blessed. Managing expenditures, monitoring cash flows, learning budgeting techniques, entertaining other sources of income. So now that there's COVID, maybe most likely these two authors are asking their followers to open up a small business here or there. And maintaining a balanced lifestyle are specific prescriptions that we find in their books. So right next to biblical verses are financial literacy skills that they offer, or tips. Very interesting. To this list could be added other skills such as managing debt, direct selling, and even investing in the stock market. Even in the stock market. Practices that are unheard of in older forms of the prosperity gospel. Managing debt, direct selling. This is quite, you find this in many developing countries. I don't think you find this in North America or Western Europe, but direct selling, through your own network, you sell certain products, clothing or food and so forth, and you're part of this big network or a big organization, and you have and as a member of that organization, you get a discount for being a member of that, and then you sell that to profit out of it. So that's it, doing it right. So you see on the quote in your screen what I read about poor people and value people just now, and rich people just now. So for these authors, next slide. For these authors, employment, paper investments, businesses, and activities that generate profit are God-sent, quote, money machines. God-sent money machines. Sanchez, in particular, believes that profit is encouraged in the scriptures. This is very interesting. He cites the parable of talents, Matthew 25:25 to 26. The parable of talents in the Gospel of Matthew. Biblical scholarship, however, explains talents in the parable of talents in terms of spiritual insight about the state of the world and what could be done to make it better. So The parable, in other words, does not validate capitalism or profit making. It's a totally different topic as far as the gospel is concerned. But in his book, the Catholic lay preacher, Sanchez, instructs his readers to monetize their God given gift to overcome financial difficulties. Um, it means earning money from their talent. Citing from his personal experience, Sanchez writes that he began charging 100,000 pesos or roughly 2,000 US dollars for each of his speaking engagements. Sanchez also recommends to stick to your game, quote, which means focusing on one's skills and specializing in them. So I've spelled out to you the three elements of the prosperity ethic: believing right, thinking right, and doing it right. And perhaps the most glaring difference, uh, perhaps, is the last one, which is about the acquisition of specific financial management skills. Do we find this in other prosperity preachers around the world? We do. But allow me to just focus on both Sanchez and Chinkee for now. Which brings me to the next question, and this is the last part of my presentation, last few minutes. Is it new? Is it really new? This is the next slide. Is it new? The argument we are making is that it is new because we are, at least in the experience of the Philippines, and many countries could also resonate with this, is that the prosperity gospel is typically associated with just believing right, having the right faith. And what you get in return from God is commensurate or is positively correlated to the amount of faith or to the degree of faith that you put in there. The more that you believe in it, the more that you subscribe to the conviction, the more that God can bless you. So it's really about faith. That's why it's called extreme faith by some theologians I have encountered. Um, and in the Philippines, we have, and this was quite the big message of Brother Mike Velarde's El Shaddai group or El Shaddai movement. This is the next photo that I will show you. Hilke. Brother Mike Velarde, the Filipinos in the audience would know him, definitely. But for the others, El Shaddai is arguably the biggest Catholic charismatic movement group in the world. At least I think Catherine Weigel, the author, the anthropologist who studied them decades ago, would make that claim. And I think she's correct in asserting that one. Why? Because El Shaddai has 9 million members in the Philippines alone, and then 2 more million around the world. Largely Filipinos who are working around the world. So are they in Germany? Yes, they're in Germany. Are they in Hong Kong? Yes, they're in Hong Kong. Are they in Singapore? Yes, they're in Singapore. So when I lived in Singapore, when I studied there back in the day, I at the basement of the building where I lived, there would be their weekly fellowship there, mostly among the domestic helpers. So Brother Mike Velarde embraced that kind of prosperity gospel. You just have to believe right, and you have to give, and everything will be given back to you. Plus, pressed down, shaken together, as the Bible puts it. So that's Brother Mike Velarde for you. So in a way, we're arguing that the prosperity gospel that we're discovering in Chinkee and Bo Sanchez are quite different from what we find in Brother Mike Velarde. The new prosperity ethic professed by Chinkee and Bo Sanchez reveals fundamental differences. Let me spell out to you a few of these differences. Number one, they are both heavily invested in their published books. Brother Mike is not. Okay. Second, while both are active members of their respective congregations, none of them has assumed a central position like Mike Velarde. Mike Velarde is still alive until today, and he's still the leader of this charismatic group. And every week they would have their celebration in the south of Metro Manila. What Sanchez and Tan claim, however, is that they are not leaders, but they are testimonies, quote unquote, more than they are preachers. Third, They target a very particular set of followers, middle class and English reading Filipinos, since they do not just rely on biblical verses for achieving prosperity, but also on practical measures to save, invest, and set up businesses. Fourth, unlike Brother Mike, who values congregational attendance and collective assembly, Tan and Sanchez have individualized their spiritual advice about finances, commercializing their books, and maintaining online sites where followers can learn about their success stories. Ladies and gentlemen, the ethic of the individual is what matters after all. The sacralization of the entrepreneurial spirit is at the heart of the new prosperity gospel. I think Carla is correct in pointing this out. Sanchez branded himself as the preacher in blue jeans. I can see some of your questions. Maybe later on we'll get to your questions later on. And yes, the head of Kerygma. Yeah, the Kerygma is a quite famous magazine here in the Philippines. Okay, in closing, let me try to sociologize everything for you right now. This is, I think this must be the second to the last slide. Neoliberal Christianity. You find this in the title of this presentation, Neoliberal Christianity. How do we account for the shift? I wish to offer to you sociological insights that could account for the rise of the prosperity ethic. Why now? Why only now? Sociology. These are typically the questions of sociologists. Why is this happening only now? Now, meaning to say in the past decade or so, compared to Brother Mike, whose movement began in the 1980s, and then it took about until only the early 2000s before both Sanchez and Chinkee became prominent. Okay. So Shane, yes, I got your question, and yes, I'll come back to that in a bit. You know, the why we're using the word ethic. You find resonances with Weber, certainly. Our observations are clearly limited to the Philippine context, but they could also be considered elsewhere. The sociological answer, we argue, lies in the economic context. It is very telling that the prosperity-oriented writings of Tan and Sanchez emerged in the mid-2000s, so around 2005. 2005. Around this time, the economic liberalization that was introduced in the 1990s was beginning to have an impact on international trade, foreign investments, and local manufacturing. Beforehand, these conditions, the free market or the liberalization of the market in the Philippines were not present. It was not present because of the corruption and inefficiency under the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos, from which the Philippine economy took a while to recover. So Marcos was our president from 1965 until 1986. You know the story, dictator and corrupt, and impoverished the Philippines. And it was only in the 1990s, post-Marcos, that the economy started to liberalize. In the 2000s, more government reforms and an improved revenue collection were particularly attractive to investors. Businesses expanded on the back of educated youths, and maybe I'm also part of that because I graduated from college in early 2000s. In fact, for the first time in history, that the population was young was no longer considered a liability by economists. Before, being young was a liability. Business process outsourcing, call centers, and the Philippines is the call center capital of the world, competing with India, at least at some point. For example, relied on an English-speaking and highly educated labor force. By 2012, the Philippines became the 44th largest economy in the world, which can even rise further to 16th place by 2050, according to HSBC Global Research. Accompanying this growth has been the rise too of the middle class. Economic reports indicate that the middle class expanded from 28.5% of the population in 1991 to 40.5% in 2015. So big jump. Middle-class Filipinos. While it may not be comparable to that of the country's neighbors, Thailand, for example, is far more successful. Vietnam is speeding up right now. The expansion of the middle class has deepened the formation of the neoliberal habitus in the Philippines. Scholars have documented this formation in different ways, in terms of consumption, in terms of the use of cars, in terms of going to the mall, individualism, urbanism, living in a condominium or private apartment, and so forth. Okay, so scholars have already pointed out the neoliberal habitus that is already present as we speak in the country. Ladies and gentlemen, the trajectory of the prosperity gospel in the Philippines coincides with the country's recent economic history. For Tremlett, Paul Tremlett, a friend of mine who's based in London, who studied El Shaddai as well, El Shaddai's prosperity gospel, quote unquote, refracted, authorized, and legitimated the neoliberal transformations that took shape in the 1990s. In effect, El Shaddai, through its mass gathering media broadcasts, sanctified the desire for moral renewal and upward social mobility, especially among the poor. Come 2005, mid-2000, at the turn of the century, and this is the quote that you find there on the screen, Tan and Sanchez have taken the prosperity gospel to the next level by targeting the aspirational middle class with a religious message that banks not only on faith, but also financial management skills. I have asserted this point so many times already. Using the words of Tremlett, the new prosperity ethic, catered specifically for the aspirational middle class, refracts, authorizes, legitimates the neoliberal habitus that has accompanied the rise of the educated youth, the growth of a highly skilled labor force, and the liberalization of the Philippine economy. I'm very close to ending already. Specifically, it provides the prosperity ethic, provides not only the religious language, not only for the aspiration, but also the very practical fulfillment of the good life for which, ladies and gentlemen, only the individual has the sole burden of making it happen. In effect, their work infuses self-help with a strong religious character. In effect, their work infuses self-help with a strong religious character. So I think you can already see the resonance with self-help here. Relying on individual responsibility, self-help literature flourished in a marketized society. That's what sociologists documented. They provide a blueprint for individuals to transform their ways of thinking and doing to achieve a subjectivity that meets the expectations of the neoliberal economy. I'm already seeing some theological comments in the chat box. Interesting. Like Tan's and Sanchez's books, self-help materials thrive based on readers' assumed life needs, which can be addressed by following practical steps authors have proven to be effective for themselves as well. The assumption is the self can be, quote, contacted, explored, and empowered with the right knowledge and technique. Adopting the neoliberal ethos, self-help materials emphasize self-reliance, industriousness, and discipline. For marrying financial skills with biblical principles, the new prosperity ethic is religious self-help. That's it. It's religious self-help. This neoliberal Christianity believes being positive is a life resource, which becomes the basis for citizens to be self-constituting and resourceful. That's a quote from Kate Bowler, who has written extensively on the prosperity gospel. This is why the books written by Tan and Sanchez have found favor among the aspirational middle class. It doesn't matter whether you're Catholic or evangelical. They are educated English readers who can appreciate the logic and discipline of financial management. In the introduction of his book, Rich God, Poor God, Tan asserts that Christianity is not about prosperity and money, quote unquote, but then goes on to show that, but the Bible has 500 verses on money and possessions. This only reveals, according to Tan, that God wants us to know that our concerns are his concerns. God talked about money matters because money also matters to him. Okay, a few more sentences and then we're ending. And if there's something that you might take away from this public lecture, this is it. It's a slide that you see right now. The prosperity ethic is emblematic of neoliberal Christianity, which places Tan and Sanchez among the ranks of the new prophets of capital. who, while troubled with the harshness of poverty, nevertheless place the burden back on the individual to navigate their lives and economic fortunes. The prosperity ethic, therefore, is a novel technology that governs the contemporary individual who is both religious and entrepreneurial. It works for the Philippines because it is a religious society and also an aspirational society. Whereas psychotherapy, personal management, and other sciences have over the 20th century come together to manage the self as a choosing individual, religion today joins the scene through the prosperity ethic. Its view of the individual remains the same. According to Nicholas Rose, selves dissatisfied with who they are can engage in therapeutic projects to refurbish and reshape themselves in the directions they desire. While promising hope in God who blesses, the prosperity ethic also calls upon individuals to seal their very aspirations by changing their ways. The message works for a society that is not only religious, but also one driven by the ambition to lift itself out of poverty. Perhaps the most important lesson that I am picking up from this discussion, ladies and gentlemen, is the burden that it places back on the individual. I will end with these lines. Yes, they're concerned about poverty, but they're indifferent to the structural causes of poverty. Maybe this is the weakness of the prosperity ethic. No wonder both Sanchez and Tan asked their readers to take responsibility for their own progress in life. The government cannot be blamed for their own circumstances. In effect, they are blessing neoliberalism, quote. In effect, the prosperity ethic is also depoliticizing Christianity. A related concern lies in individualizing poverty. In our view, the theological baggage of the prosperity ethic for valuing hard work renders poverty as the problem of the lazy. That's why a while ago, right, Chinkee had to discuss the difference between, had to distinguish the rich from the poor based on their attitudes. Indeed, Tan himself claims that poor people put more value in entertainment than in educating themselves. Aaron and I cannot neglect this point because in spite of its stellar performance, the country's economic growth has historically lagged compared to its neighbors. The reality is that achieving financial security is a daily struggle for the majority, including the precarious middle class, who are in themselves the targeted consumers of the prosperity ethic. I will end there and hear from Angie, and we'll have the open forum now. Angie? Oh, those are my contact details, and those are the links from which I took the photos.
Thank you, Jayeel, for this exciting talk. I would like to give the floor now to another member of the faculty of the UCSIA Summer School, Angie Heo. She is Assistant Professor of Anthropology and Sociology of Religion at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. She's an anthropologist of religion, media, and economy, and is broadly interested in minority politics, critical mission history, post-colonial nationalism, and global religious movements. In 2018, her first book, The Political Lives of Saints, Christian-Muslim Mediation in Egypt, was published. She's currently working on her second book, which deals with various sides of religious freedom, transnational capitalism, and Cold War empire in the Korean Peninsula. Angie, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me? I'm wondering if I'm on here.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks. So I just want to say, whenever I hear Professor Cornelio give a talk, I'm so inspired. I feel myself kind of filled with the force of charisma and goodwill. And so I'd like to thank Professor Cornelio for sharing his research with us. I'm also delighted to see that there are 100 listeners, 100 viewers attending this session. So I'm excited to hear more about the hear more from the Q&A about what the listeners have to say about the talk. And I do want to say that I have kind of generated two questions in the spirit of fostering more discussion, not so much kind of calling on Professor Cornelio to answer directly my questions, although of course I welcome his expertise, but I'm hoping that kind of the questions that I pitch to the group will allow us to have a little bit more discussion and kick off some Q&A from participants all over the world, it seems. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you out there. I'm interested, I think Jayeel was just mentioning that I have an interest in studying Christianity in South Korea and kind of more broadly the political economy of Christianity in the Korean Peninsula. And there's a way in which when I heard the talk today about the prosperity ethic, and particularly really what I heard it, how I heard the description and the analysis of the prosperity in the Philippines is really kind of speaking more broadly to the rise of neoliberalized religious movements across the world. And not even necessarily specific to Christianity per se, although I'm sure this will be highly debatable in our Q&A, highly debatable point. But I do have this question about what the location and the context and the history of the Philippines has to say about a broader global phenomenon that is the rise of an aspirational middle class, what is being called the global middle classes since the 1990s, and indeed the increasing financialization of religious institutions and movements. How do we think about the Philippines as a comparative case? That is, how do we think comparatively with the Philippines about a broader global phenomenon? And my second question is kind of picking up from the last minutes of Professor Cornelio's talk concerning the politics of this prosperity ethic. And when I say politics, I think I mean more directly and explicitly the politics of the state. I had the good fortune of, no pun intended, listening or watching Thomas Piketty's Capitalism in the 21st Century last night. And so I'm thinking a lot about the kind of narrative of development and kind of the particular structuring of the welfare state under neoliberalized economies globally. I wonder who contests the prosperity ethic within the political landscape of the Philippines. That is, we have a good kind of overview of the internal logics of the advocates of the prosperity ethic. I'm wondering who are the actors, institutions, voices who oppose the prosperity ethic and on what grounds, and what does the prosperity ethic do for the politics of state welfare in the Philippines? And it seems, I mean, I am reading about the Philippines under the COVID crisis. I'm wondering about the politics of public care, public health, the public good. What does the prosperity ethic have to say in response to what seems to be what is a collective issue in the nation? So I welcome your response. I'm not sure how you want to do this, but I will hand it over to Jayeel.
Yes, thank you. Jayeel, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I should respond. Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
All right, just very quickly, because we also have so many questions. Angie, thank you so much. Really good to see you, at least virtually. Too bad that we're not in Antwerp right now. Those are very important points from which I think we can spur the conversation with the others in the audience. Where do we locate the Philippines? I think we can answer that from the point of view of the sociology of religion and also sociology of development, because you mentioned the rise of the global middle class and where the Filipinos are in this rising middle class. So maybe let me talk about first the rise of the middle class. In my other writings, I have described modernity in the Philippines as a rather incomplete kind of modernity, in the sense that you have a precarious middle class who are unable to sustain the middle classness. I think the literature describes this phenomenon as the precariat. And so you have, and economists have described in the Philippines, have also referred to the very precarious situation of the middle class here. You know, in many ways, it's very easy to be middle class in the Philippines. It's just a matter of going above the the poverty threshold, and that already makes you fall under the low middle class. But it's precisely this huge chunk of Filipinos, middle class they are, but who are precarious because anytime that there's an economic shock, for example, their relatives are working abroad, lose their jobs, automatically they slide down back to poverty. And this is why their kids could no longer go to private schools, which is a symbol of middle classness in the country, and so forth. So there is a global rise of the middle class, but certainly not the kind that you find in China or in Hong Kong or in Singapore or in many East Asian miracles, which is why I think, Angie, the prosperity ethic works so well, because it provides the ontological security to the precariat character of this aspirational but precarious middle class here, right? Why? Because both Sanchez and Chinkee will tell you that, well, you can't be lazy. You gotta firm up. You gotta fight for the blessings of God in your life. You do that by acquiring the skills. God already gave you the wisdom. It's just a matter of activating them, not through faith. Yes, believing right, thinking right are quite important, but acquiring the right skills. So is that unique? Is the prosperity ethic that we find in both Sanchez and Chinkee different? In many ways, they also resonate. What you find in Joel Osteen, for example, or in many of the self-help writers, much of their writings have religious elements there. So in a way, I won't make the claim that this is unique to the Philippines, precisely because I think the kind of Christianity that you find in the Philippines, as you do elsewhere, say in Africa or Latin America, is that these are Christian movements that are globally connected, transnationally connected. So prosperity, you can come up with a transnational prosperity network and make the links between Singapore's mega churches, New Creation Church there, or City Harvest, and they invite one another, the preachers, some of them visit the Philippines, and then these Filipinos go elsewhere to preach, etc. So the global circulation of the prosperity gospel, and then they pick up these messages. I think that's a more important point to make there. And then finally, regarding your second point, which I think is very important, what's the politics of care here? And what messages do we find from these speakers and from these preachers? This is quite interesting, and I invite the Filipinos in the audience who are interested in this to be also conducting this research, maybe building on what I have presented just now, that their social media accounts, they're essentially echoing exactly the same thing, Angie. Essentially the same thing. Now it's not the time to be lazy. Now it's not the time to give up. You gotta do things. You gotta be more entrepreneurial. And so they have all these self-help tips and financial tips that they provide. Why? Because God is not, the theology is still there. God still wants to bless you even in times. Therefore, the kind of politics that they would want is the free market politics, a politics that just enables and strengthens, reinforces the neoliberal habitus, namely that you are on your own. So very conservative, if you will, believing in the free market. But maybe our audience has a different opinion there. I'll end there so that we can entertain more questions. What do you think, Angie? Did I answer your question? Did you want to?
I mean, I just want to pick up on so I don't know much about the Philippines as much as I'd like to, but it seems that that it would be important. It's one of the questions that I have is that it seems that the kind of critiques of neoliberalism and kind of the welfare state under the shadow of neoliberalism often presume a certain kind of democratic polity. And it seems that the Philippines, especially now, doesn't have that luxury. In other words, is there something specific about rule under Duterte that precludes the normal critique of the neoliberal kind of welfare state, that it doesn't translate to the Philippines, and therefore the emergence of the prosperity ethic kind of takes a different term and kind of redoubles in force in different ways. I wonder about that. I wonder if there's something to be said about the specific political economy of the Philippines that could actually
right now under Duterte.
Yeah. I also recognize this is an extremely sensitive topic, and I don't know how your internet situation is. You're calling in from the Manila, so I recognize that, and I just want to put that out there for all our listeners.
The internet connection doesn't have to do with Duterte, but my recent scholarship, Angie, and you are somehow familiar with what I have been doing, and some of those in the audience are familiar with what I have written about the war on drugs and how fundamentalism in the country has taken on a militant form. It's quite interesting, to be honest, because on one level you have this kind of Christianity that celebrates prosperity, but at another level you have a militant Christianity that is homophobic, that wants the death penalty back, that doesn't have a very limited view of gender equality, and is very supportive of the war on drugs. In a way, you can argue that those are two different levels or permutations of Christianity in contemporary Philippine society. But perhaps, Angie, and this is still hypothetical, and I need to come up with the research to verify this empirically. There could be connections because we know that in the U.S., the sociology of religion literature would also show that there is what's the Weberian term there? Elective affinity. The elective affinity between supporting Trump and being of a particular brand of fundamentalism, and prosperity preaching may have those elements of fundamentalism, and I see already some of those in the audience already asking questions about the progressive forms of Christianity in the Philippines. Certainly, you will not find progressive theology from the prosperity ethic. So most likely you will find their affinity, its affinity with the Christianity that supports the regime as we know it now. Maybe I should end there. That's all right. Thanks, Angie. Hilke, Ellen, are you moderating?
Yes. Hi, Jayeel. Thank you, Angie, for your thought-provoking questions. And
hey.
We are running out of time, but we have a lot of questions. So they're very complex questions. I would have preferred them to insert into a poll, but it's not possible because they're too long. So I listed them and I posted all the questions, Jayeel, in your chat. So maybe you can choose one.
Yes.
Questions. I can do it for you as well, but maybe it's for the best that you do it because.
Right. Okay. We've got several questions here. Okay. We'll try to cover everything. Okay. We've got one question from Stein. Did Sanchez also read a passage in scripture where Jesus warns that it's more difficult for a rich person to enter heaven than for a camel to crawl through the eye of a needle? Most likely they are familiar with this, and they will be very different ways. In fact, Stein, what is interesting about the particular passage is that it has been reframed not just by Sanchez, but very many prosperity-oriented preachers in other countries. That is really a rhetoric device by Jesus Christ to say that there's so much about wealth that we should pursue. But let me try to study that more closely after this. I'm taking note of that. Thanks, Stein. And yes, we should have our muscles again there in Antwerp. Michael Bunyi has this point. Interesting how I think right has two meanings: right as ethically approaching money, and right as referring to a political spectrum somewhat. Yes, you're right. Right, Michael. We use the word right in this piece mainly not as a normative a concept, but really as derived from their own worldview, which is why it is a prosperity ethic. And Shane, this is Shane's question as well. Is it, are we referring to the Calvinist tradition, or are we somehow invoking the Weberian connection between prosperity and pre-election? Those are, of course, we know that in the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, it is precisely because one is called that they are blessed, that they are enriched. We find resonances, theologically speaking, in the prosperity ethic, and certainly we find it as well in the form of hard work, now in the form of in acquiring the financial management skills and so forth. The point, but primarily we're using the word ethic to refer to the hard work component of the new prosperity gospel, that you have to do something in order to activate it. So there are right ways of believing, right ways of thinking, attitude, and then right ways of doing. But specifically, we wanted to emphasize the doing it right component there. Bonifacio's question is this: do we know the formation of Sanchez and Ortan? Did he metamorphose from a non-prosperity gospel advocate into one? How did that transformation take place? What were the main factors influenced? Bonifacio, this is a good question. We didn't want to study the biography of Sanchez and Tan. What we wanted to do was really to sociologize the discourse. We were not so much interested in Sanchez and Tan as we were interested in the movement, in the movement of the prosperity gospel in the Philippines. You consider El Shaddai as prosperity preaching, but we also consider the Sanchez and Tan's message as prosperity gospel. But obviously there are very important differences there. But might I say, if I could right now, is that you have a very different habitus for Sanchez and Tan. They grew up in middle-class backgrounds, English-speaking backgrounds, and we know that specifically Bo Sanchez, he was a motivational speaker back in the 1990s. He was not known for prosperity, for anything like that, until the first book, I think around 2005, if I'm not mistaken, and so that's when the turn happened. We could have done that too, study the life of the biography of the individual, but we leave it to somebody else. Maybe you could do that. We were more interested in the sociological explanation for the movement, for the shift. Okay, but if that's a good question, worth investigating later on. Jamina. So I'm just going through the motions here. Okay. Jamina, who was my PhD student in Germany, in Göttingen. Hi, Jamina. What is the place, if any, of mutual assistance in the new prosperity ethic? Mutual assistance, correct, is a hallmark of the Iglesia ni Cristo, which has denounced prosperity gospel as heresy. It's funny, right? Do proponents of prosperity gospel also differ from the INC regarding their use of mutual assistance? Good question. They might in fact just be very similar, because if you, especially Bo Sanchez's organization has become so sophisticated that they have their own foundations as well. And this is not really different in the case of Iglesia ni Cristo, which has its own foundation, and they're helping several communities, especially in times of disaster and so forth. But bear in mind, Iglesia ni Cristo can be explained very differently, and I think you've read my piece about Iglesia ni Cristo. Well, what's particularly interesting about the prosperity ethic is that there is no understanding of poverty as a structural matter. Therefore, there is no progressive theology there, right? It's really all about empowering the individual, building his capacity or her capacity, so that he or she becomes more equipped to do that. Dovetail that with what they're doing in their foundations, education and livelihood programs and so forth. So you see that it's the same spirit that imbues even their civic engagements, mutual assistance, as you call it. And then another question we have here is that how do supporters of the prosperity ethic use or critique more classical notions of sacrifice and penitence in Filipino Catholicism? That's a powerful, very, very smart question. There may be an element of sacrifice on the way to prosperity, but it does not sound like older notions of sacrifice by, say, Eleto. Okay, right. Do I remember correctly that Sanchez has explicitly criticized what he sees as the Filipino martyr complex? Yeah, or even for Tan, right? That it could be much of the Filipino habitus or belief or worldviews or orientations might in fact deepen the impoverishment of Filipinos. So it's not so much about sacrifice for the sake of poverty, but it's really sacrifice. You gotta strive hard for the sake of your mobility. And then, okay, just Dr. Rosette Librea has this question. Has prosperity ethics secularized the tenets of the gospel in doing good and avoiding evil? Has it not brought false hopes to the poor in liberating themselves from their socio-economic conditions? Really, really good questions, Dr. Rosette. I really appreciate these questions. Has it secularized the tenets of the gospel in doing good and avoiding evil? I'm wearing the sociologist hat right now, not the believer that I am, or theologically oriented person that I am, but you can argue that there is a secularization there. But there are other, because it becomes more and more secular with its aspirations. But at the same time, we can also say, in sociology of religion, there are different religious trends at work, trends that explain or account for religious change. And this could also be pointing to detraditionalization, for example, or different, just thinking of other religious trends or sacralization. This is because this is primarily connected to the charismatic movement. So if you put it back in its religious context, namely the charismatic movement, then it's not as secularized as it may sound, based on the presentation that I have. So, but those are very powerful questions. Okay. Timothy Quintos. Timothy has a question. A student of philosophy. I have two questions. What are the dangers attached in following the principles of these so-called prosperity preachers? And what should be the alternative for their teaching? In other words, what should be done? Oh, thank you. Greetings from Manila. Hello also. Tim, how would I answer this? I leave it up to the philosophers in the house and the theologians to answer these questions, the normative questions. But I will say anyway, and it's already evident in the very conclusion of my presentation, that I am personally very critical of how this theology individualizes poverty, because we know that poverty is not an individualized matter in the Philippines. It is structural. We know that much of poverty in the country is related to the spread of oligarchies, political dynasties, and corruption, and so forth. We know this to be the case. But so in a way, theologically speaking, the prosperity preaching is a band-aid solution to a structural problem. Therefore, it will not solve the problem of poverty in the Philippines, even if both Sanchez and Chinkee admit to themselves that they are deeply bothered by the situation of poverty in the country. It's only to them. It's just that to them, the solution is by empowering individuals to redeem themselves, not from sin, but from the poverty of their mindset, from the poverty of their habits, from the poverty of their culture, even. So in that sense, I'm very critical. Which is why you might know, Tim, that I have been advocating public theology and for differentiation perspectives to come into play and really have a intelligent discussion when it comes to these things. Not because we want to criticize for the sake of criticizing, but because we want to deepen the theological understanding and the sociological consequences of these teachings. Of course, not everyone would appreciate that. Juness has a question where, last few questions here. Juness has a question. Juness Chrysostomo, how can we make progressive Christian rhetoric, one that understands the liberation and social justice aspects of the gospel, more relatable to this precarious middle class? Tricky question, Juness. I really could feel where you're coming from. I feel that you are burdened by the absence of social justice rhetoric in religious circles in the country. This is where public theology comes in. I think most of the time, religious groups are very much isolated from each other. So you've got the prosperity ethic people who only talk to one another, sing each other's songs, and congratulate each other for their successful businesses, right? And then you have the social justice Christians, the more progressive Christians, who only preach to themselves, right? And that's not much interaction. And if there are any interaction, if there's any interaction, most of the time they can be hostile, condescending, violent, and so forth. I think the principles of public theology challenge us to really be engaging and be willing to be engaged along the way. Not because we are right and they're wrong, but because maybe there are ways of helping one another discover the wisdoms of our different theological persuasions. And this is why the public sphere is very important. What we do on social media, what we write as scholars, and finally what we write for the public. You know, some of us do write for newspapers, and we are very much engaged in engaging the communities. It's bit by bit. I don't think we can simply convert the middle class, the precarious middle class, just like that. The social justice rhetoric does not appeal to the precarious middle class. It takes a lot of community organizing to activate that ethos there. Ellen, okay, you alerted me already to the time. Should I entertain one more question or? Oh, thank you, Janice. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Yes, let's do one more question. We have time for one more.
Okay. But these are all great questions, Hilke. How can we just skip them? Right. These are all wonderful questions. I knew it. I knew 30 minutes would it and it's already what 10, 20 here in the Philippines. You choose for me.
Okay.
Because these are all great questions. I feel like I'm gonna be ruthless. Sorry guys, I know that you have so many questions, but Hilke is gonna choose one for us.
How about the question of Ikena? Do you find some dissenting voices within Pentecostalism who are against prosperity gospel?
Ikena, do you? Oh, great! This is a smart question. Ikena is Ikena part of the summer school this year?
No, I don't think so.
All right. Okay. Hello, Ikena. Do you think some dissenting voices within there are dissenting voices within Pentecostalism, Ikena, and this is why, however, they are not really the majority. You might know already the history of Pentecostalism, Ikena. Pentecostalism began as a movement among the poor. We already know that. So in fact, the earlier writings among Pentecostals were very much social justice oriented. They were very much interested in the structural causes of poverty. And this is what the history of Pentecostalism would tell us. But along the way, when it got married, and this is why in the first part of my presentation, I had to spell out the trajectory of the prosperity ethic. Once it got married to the New Thought movement, and then became articulated in the Word of Faith movement, that's when it started. That's when it started to lose the social justice gravitas that it used to have. But might I say anyway that it's still there. It's still there. There are Pentecostal preachers who are very much conscious of inequality and social injustice, but they don't get really the limelight. Certainly in scholarship, certainly in media coverage, certainly in conversations like this. By this, I mean those who have become disenchanted by the wealth of the preachers on the one hand and the poverty of most members in the context of tendency. Yes, I think so too. And I encourage you, Ikenna, perhaps this is a research area that you can pursue. I'm going to think about this also in the context of the Philippines. Really smart question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jayeel, for making
Excellent.
this. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for joining. Putting these interesting questions. I really had a blast. And I'm really looking forward to meeting you all live in Antwerp next year. Thank you all. And stay tuned for all UCSIA activities on our websites and maybe for the recording if you want to look back on some of the questions. So thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Cornelio. Thank you, Professor Ha. Thank you, Ellen, also for helping me out today. And have a good evening, morning, day. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, and if I could encourage everyone as well, please get in touch with me. You got my contact details. I would love to hear your thoughts, maybe in private, and we can communicate. And I do respond, whether it's by email or Twitter. And I would just like to say hello to all my friends who are here. Yasna, who's from Göttingen, Karen is in Antwerp. Thank you so much for being here. Really, really wonderful. Those are my contact details. Thank you so much. Thank you. And thanks, Hilke and Ellen and Angie, my friends. All right. So,
Bye.
all right. All right. All right. Bye now.